Hey everybody, this is Dream, and this is gonna be my top picks for the big 14 or 13 game slate for college football tomorrow on Saturday. These games start at noon and go all the way through 4 p.m. start times. So we have quite a few games here. A couple games, Cincinnati, Georgia, and Minnesota all look like they're probably gonna blow out their opponents, and then most of the other games are pretty close, are close enough that you can feel pretty good that most of the players are going to play the entire game. So without further ado, before I get into the players themselves, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't. It really helps the channel, and I really appreciate it. There's also a Discord. You can find that in the description, and Patreon. So feel free to check those out at your discretion. And let's go and get into the players themselves. So at quarterback, I've got a few guys that you can choose from, and some of them are a little bit more expensive, others a little bit cheaper. So the first guy I'm looking at is Dylan Gabriel. He's thrown for 529 yards so far this season. He's averaging about 25 attempts a game, which is a little bit lower than most of the other quarterbacks here. But overall, he's in a good situation here against Nebraska, and I think that he's going to have a chance to score a pretty good amount of points. They're one of the highest scoring teams on the slate when it comes to not blowing somebody out, but also having a high Vegas odds total. They have the number one Vegas total at 66.5 points for the game, and they have a spread of 10 points above, or minus 10 for Oklahoma against Nebraska. So I think he's somebody you have to consider simply because of that, and because he's been playing pretty well. Then I have, let's see here, Jaren Hall for BYU against Oregon. He's pretty inexpensive too. That helps. He's thrown 71 passes on the season and 3 touchdowns. He's doing pretty good this season, and he's in a matchup where he's gonna probably be right in the game the entire time, and so he's gonna have to, pass the ball a little bit more than he has the first couple weeks. But I do think he's in a good position here. He did throw 1 interception in one of the games, but I think he's in a great spot. So he's somebody that I really like him as a top option at this particular position. Another guy that I like is O'Connell for Purdue against Syracuse. This is a little bit of a tougher matchup than maybe that you would like. Syracuse does tend to run the ball some, so I do think McConnell has some. He's probably not going to get quite as many attempts as he's gotten in the first few games, but he's thrown 78 passes, and he's actually the second highest on the slate when it comes to pass attempts for quarterbacks. And he also has 5 touchdowns so far this season. But this game should, this game has a spread of 1 point, and it's a 58.5 expected points total. So I think that it's a pretty solid game to look at quarterbacks, especially Purdue's. The other guy, obviously, in this game is the Syracuse quarterback, Schrader. He is also in a great spot. He's not throwing the ball as much. He's 38 for 48 with 528 yards and 5 touchdowns this season. But I think both these quarterbacks are going to get a lot of work. And then, like I said, Syracuse does tend to run the ball a little bit more than some teams. But their running backs also do get some catches. So Schrader should have some opportunity from that perspective as well. Schrader is also a guy that does tend to run the ball. I should have showed that. You can see that he's had several attempts in each game, and he has potential for touchdowns in that aspect as well. So he's a really good option, I think, today at quarterback, and he's also pretty inexpensive. Then we have Thompson for Nebraska. He's going up against Oklahoma, which is a little bit harder, but I still think he's in a good spot here. He's throwing the ball more than anybody else on the slate. 97 attempts this season, including 866 yards and 4 touchdowns. Now, obviously, he's played 3 games instead of 2, so that does affect. But I still think that he's in a good spot, and he's going to have to throw the ball a lot because he's going to have to come from behind in this particular game. And, Nebraska hasn't been very good, but he has been throwing for 300-plus yards each game, and so I think he's in a good spot here. The next guy that I like is Thompson Robinson for UCLA. Now, he doesn't throw the ball near as much as some of the other guys on the slate, but he does run the ball more. Not quite as much as Schrader does at Syracuse, but he still does run the ball pretty good. Now, he is going to be in a game where he's favored to win by 15 points, but I do think that he has some pretty good upside here, and he's been throwing the ball pretty well. He's not as big of a thrower as some of the other guys, obviously, but he's somebody you have to consider based on the matchup and stuff like that. And then Toon for Houston. He's the last quarterback I like, 8,200. He's thrown 71 passes for 472 yards and 4 touchdowns this season. And he's actually done okay in his games, even against some tougher opponents in Texas Tech. And so I think he's in a good spot to have a really good game here. Houston is favored to win this game by 10 points against Kansas. And so I think he has some real upside in this particular matchup. At running back, I have a little bit more options at running back and wide receiver, and I've tried to mix around some guys that are cheaper and more expensive, and so I'll go ahead and get into this. My first guy is Grant for Nebraska, and I've done this kind of by in a random order, so just bear with that. Anthony Grant for Nebraska. He's had some pretty solid games so far. He's run 69 times for 428 yards and 5 touchdowns. Now, he does run the ball more than most other running backs on this slate, and so I really like him. You know, he's averaging 20 to 25 a game in the 3 games, and so I think he's in a better spot than a lot of the other guys who don't run the ball near as much, especially teams. And in order for Nebraska to hang up, to be consistent in this game, he's going to have to score a lot of points. And so, if you think Nebraska can hold their own in this game, then he's somebody you have to take a look at. Campbell for Houston is in a really great spot here. Though he doesn't run the ball near as much. He's only got 31 attempts on the season, so about 15. But he does have touchdown potential in this game, and against a lackluster opponent. And he did good last week against Texas Tech, and he also gets some passing attempts, and so I think he's in a good spot in this particular matchup. Gray for Oklahoma is another guy I like. Now he actually does get a couple more attempts than Campbell does, but he also gets some pass attempts, and I think he's in a good spot here. He still hasn't gotten his first touchdown of the season. Oklahoma hasn't they've been blowing out their opponents. I think this game will be a little bit closer, but it's still got a blowout potential, obviously. But it's a 10-point spread, and so I think he's going to get more opportunities in this particular game, and will pay off much better than he did in the first 2 weeks. Then I have McIntosh. Where is he? McIntosh for Georgia against South Carolina. Obviously, McIntosh has not had to run the ball too much so far this season because they've just absolutely destroyed their opponents. But he also gets some receiving yards. He's actually got 14 receptions in the first 2 games as well. And so even if he doesn't get the attempts, he's definitely going to get some of those. And so it gives him some more points. And he's actually pretty inexpensive on DraftKings, only $6,700. And if the game does somehow stay close, which it probably won't, but if it does, he'd really definitely get more carries as well. The next guy I like is Abraham from Minnesota. He's obviously pretty expensive. He does run the ball quite a bit, and he's got opportunity for touchdowns. Not a guy that really gets a lot of catches in the backfield, but he's still scoring pretty consistently so far this season, and he's got a nice plus matchup here to be similar to the first 2 weeks, and so I think he's got a lot of upside in this particular matchup. Obviously, his price is pretty expensive, so you're going to have to get some other guys that are cheap in order to help deal with that, but there's definitely options available. Then Ray Davis for Vanderbilt is another guy I think is in a good spot here. He's $6,800. He's had 47 attempts so far this season. And this game should be a little bit closer, and they should be able to hang with him better. And so I think that this will be than like last week's game against Wake Forest that said he should have more opportunities in this game to score points. And so I like him in this particular matchup. Then we have Trey Potts from Minnesota, who's in a good spot here for himself. Now, he doesn't get as many rushing attempts as some of the other guys, but he's got a better yards per game average than a lot of them, and he's been scoring about 17 fantasy points a game, which I think is doable in this particular matchup against a bad Colorado team. He's obviously the second running back on Minnesota, but both of them are going to have good days. Tucker for Syracuse. He's probably one of my favorite running backs on the slate, simply because not only does he rush 48 times the first two games, but he's also getting a lot of good catch yards and stuff like that. So he's in a similar position to Georgia's running back, and obviously he's more expensive, but I think he's in a really great spot, and he's going to have potential to be the top scoring back on the entire slate against Purdue. Two more guys here, Charbonnet for UCLA. Now he's probably one of the least used running backs on this particular slate, but he's only played in one game, so that's part of the reason. He didn't play a second week because he had a little bit of injury, but he does have the potential to run, and get a touchdown, and he's averaging a pretty decent yards per carry, so I think he's in play assuming his injury is nice and better. So, and he's got a nice plus matchup here in this one. And then finally, Evans for Mississippi against Georgia Tech. He's had a pretty good year to start, 31 carries with almost 200 yards and a touchdown. Now, he hasn't been used as much as some of the other guys because Ole Miss does like to pass the ball, but he does have some potential for receptions, even though he didn't really get one last week where they just blew somebody out. He should get more yards in this game simply because he's going to get more attempts against a little bit tougher opponent than the first 2 weeks. So that's what I have at running back. And at wide receiver, we have some good options here. This is really where you're going to save most of the money, I think. And so I definitely think that you need to, try to get a couple balanced quarterbacks for the quarterback in the S-flex position. And then, maybe pay up for a running back and have some value there. And then, kind of go cheaper on the wide receiver route just because there's so many good options available at this position. Obviously, there's some expensive guys as well, but I think that there's some, good ones across the board. So my first guy I like is Camper for Indiana. Now, he's pretty inexpensive at $4,800. He's got 15 receptions so far this season and almost 200 yards. He hasn't got a touchdown yet, but this kind of game where I think, Indiana is actually going to be a much better team in this particular one, so I think he has a good shot at getting his first touchdown of the season. For Purdue, I have Mr. Jones against Syracuse. I think he's going to be a big option this week. Obviously, he's super expensive, but he has 21 receptions and 4 touchdowns. There's only a couple guys that have more than 4 touchdowns so far to start the season, but he is absolutely scoring very well. Now, this is a tougher matchup than what he had in the second week where he had crazy amount of points, but even against Penn State, he did pretty well, so I think he's in a good spot in this particular matchup. And then Tucker for NIU is a guy I like here, Cole Tucker. He's got a little bit tougher matchup because he hasn't gone up against the SEC school yet this season. But Vanderbilt's, probably one of the weakest SEC schools when it comes to defense and stuff. And this game it looks like it's going to be pretty tight. And he's going to have some potential to score a decent amount of points in this matchup. For Western Kentucky, I have Davis, who has had a pretty good season to start. 11 receptions for 202 yards and a touchdown. Obviously, against the opponent, Indiana, he's going to have some opportunity here and potentially get some more and get a couple of touchdowns too. Then we'll look at DJ Matthews. Here we go. DJ Matthews for Indiana. I really like him in this matchup. He's probably one of my favorite cheaper options. He has some touchdown potential, and this is probably going to be a bit easier game defensively for him to score points, as in that the defense is a little bit weaker than his first 2 opponents, and he's done pretty well with 10 for 160 and 2 touchdowns, and getting those touchdowns is definitely going to be an advantage in this particular slate. Wayne for the South Alabama, 13 for 196 yards and 3 touchdowns. Now, obviously, this is a tougher opponent than what he's had, but I still think he's in a good spot in this particular matchup. The spread on this game is 15 points, so it's a little bit risky, but I think that he has touchdown potential, and he's been playing pretty well for them, even against even though it's been against bad opponents. Uh, excuse me. Then I have Allen for UCLA against South Alabama. He has 14 receptions for 115 yards and a touchdown, and I think that he's going to have some opportunity here. The first 2 weeks have been blowouts, and this one might end up being a little bit of a blowout, but I do think it's going to be a little bit closer than some of the other 2 games he's been in. So he's somebody to take a look at here. And then we have Mayer for Notre Dame against California. Now Notre Dame has not been very good this year so far, but he has actually been pretty decent despite the losses. He has 135 yards with a touchdown and 13 receptions. Now the first week is against Ohio State, and this week California is going to be a lot easier than Ohio State was, so I look for him to have a potentially breakout game here. And then we have Mims from Oklahoma, obviously pretty expensive against Nebraska, but he has 10 receptions for 244 yards, 2 touchdowns, and he should be able to continue to play well in this particular matchup. Then I have Dell for Houston against Kansas. I really like this guy. I've used him both the first 2 weeks, and he's paid off pretty well, 24 and 22 points. He gets a lot of chances at receptions and touchdowns, and the games have been pretty tight, and I suspect that tomorrow's game will be very similar in that. Probably be a little bit more Houston favored, but I still think it's going to be pretty close. And then Shepard for Vanderbilt is my last pick. He's 13 for 142 with 5 touchdowns. Now, obviously, the opponents have made it relatively easy in the first 3 games, but he's in a good spot, and I don't think NIU's defense is going to be able to stop him really. So he's somebody that I think is very good, and he's in a good spot defense from a price point as well. So with that said, I think we have a pretty good slate. I think you can work out some of the guys that are going to be cheaper. There's not as much value on the slate as you would like based on the prices, but it's a 3 weeks in, and so they're starting to get the prices a little bit more accurate as to how what the depth charts and stuff are going to look like as the season progresses. Obviously, as injuries happen, you're going to find more value that way as well. And so as the season goes on, we're probably going to have weeks where there's a lot of value mixed in with high price guys that are rising. But overall, I think this week is a pretty solid week to play, and obviously there's plenty of games to choose from. So if you there's plenty of good teams playing. So with that said, thank you guys for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and have a nice day.